Central attack, side 1. This opening begins 1 pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white knight f3, black knight c6, white pawn to d4, black pawn takes on d4, and white bishop to c4. The aims of the opening for white are fast development and a possible attack on the black king, which is often left in the center. Now, in this position, the main move for black is to play knight to f6, but we'll look first at the move bishop c5. Now here white can actually try and transpose into his Max Lange lines, which are the main point of the opening, by castling here. White could castle, and then if black plays knight f6, then pawn to e5 does transpose into the Max Lange. But black could also possibly play pawn to d6, in which case white could play pawn c3 and sacrifice a pawn. Black pawn takes on c3, white knight takes on c3, and here black knight to f6 would be dangerous if white continued bishop g5, so black will play knight ge7, then bishop g5, black castles, white knight to d5, black bishop to e6, white queen to d2. White has maybe got threats now of playing pawn to b4 and pawn to b5. So black plays pawn to a5, and white could continue with moves like rook c1 and rook d1, or possibly queen f4, with some compensation for the sacrificed pawn. Well, this is just an idea in case you want to avoid the lines I'm about to suggest, the lines of the Giocco piano. Now we'll return to diagram 1. Switch off the tape while you're doing so. And from diagram 1 we play back black bishop to c5. White can now play pawn to c3. And if black plays pawn takes c3 here, what would you do as white now? Turn off the tape and decide your answer. Well, white can play a combination here. Bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and then queen d5 check, which regains the piece and of course leaves black in some difficulties, as his king won't be able to castle. So we return those pieces. White queen back to d1, black king back to e8, black pawn to f7, white bishop is on c4, the black pawn is on d4, and the white pawn is on c3. So after white pawn to c3, black is more likely to play knight to f6. Then comes pawn takes d4, and we are actually in a variation of the Giocco piano. Here black's best is to play bishop b4 check, and white could now play the gambit line with knight c3, which is described in the audio chess booklet Silent Encounter, or he can play the recommendation of Keene and Levy, which is bishop to d2, and we'll look at that now. Bishop to d2. Now here too it looks like black can win a pawn by playing knight takes e4. However, white has got a good continuation then. Now turn off your tapes and see if you can find it. White can play bishop takes b4, black knight takes b4, white bishop takes f7 check, black king takes f7, and now queen b3 check recovers the piece again. Black goes pawn to d5, white queen takes b4, and in this position material is level, but white has a slight advantage. In the first place, his knight on f3 will have a secure outpost at e5, whereas the black knight at e4 could eventually be driven away by the white pawn coming up to f3. And secondly, the bishop at c8 is somewhat limited by the black pawn at d5 on the same color as the bishop. Also, of course, the black king are not quite as secure as the white king. Now we return to the position of diagram 2. Turn off your tapes while you're resetting the position. So from diagram 2, black cannot win the pawn with knight takes e4. He therefore plays bishop takes d2 check, white knight takes on d2, and now white has got a powerful pawn center, and black breaks it up with the move pawn to d5. White pawn takes on d5, and black plays knight takes on d5. Now in this position you would expect white to castle on the king's side, but in fact he plays immediately queen to b3. This takes advantage of the fact that black cannot play his knight from c6 to a5. At least he can't play it there with advantage. If he plays knight to a5 here, trying to sort of swap off the white bishop at c4, white could reply queen a4 check. And in order to save his knight, black must play either his knight back to c6 or play his pawn to c6. After pawn to c6, white could play bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, and the black knight at a5 is stranded on the edge of the board. So this continuation wouldn't be that good for black. Now we'll return those pieces. The black queen back to d8, the black pawn back to c7, the black knight goes back onto d5, the other black knight on c6, the white queen on b3, and the white bishop at c4. Therefore, after white's queen b3 move, black has to defend his knight in a more passive manner. So he plays knight from c6 to e7. White castles, king's side. Black castles on the king's side. White rook from f1 to e1. A black pawn to c6. White pawn to a4. Now, looking at this position, black has a very solidly defended knight at d5, a good central outpost, but at the same time he is cramped because white has the open files. His rook is well placed at e1, the other rook can come to c1. White's also cramping the black queen side, and his knights have got good scope. One can come into e5 and the other could probably come round to e4 and then to c5. So in general, black has a difficult game in this position due to the greater white space and greater white activity. Right, now we return again to the position of diagram 1. From diagram 1, after bishop c5, white pawn to c3, black can try another defense, and this is pawn from d4 moves down to d3. The idea of this is to return the pawn and disrupt white's development, because the white pawn at c3 now prevents the white knight coming out to to a good square, which of course keeps the white rook in. Nonetheless, in this position, from a game between Ashok Petrosian and Sveshnikov, white obtained the advantage by advancing his pawns on the queen side, as we shall see when we go through this game. So after black pawn to d3, white castled. Black played pawn to d6. And now white didn't recapture the pawn. No, he played his pawn from b2 to b4. The black bishop retreated to b6. White played pawn from a2 to a4, threatening to win a piece now by moving down his pawn to a5. So black gave his bishop a bolt hole. He played pawn to a6. White pawn to a5. Black bishop back to a7. Now, how would you continue for white here? Well, white still did not retake the pawn. He played his queen from d1 to b3. And because black hasn't castled, he has some difficulties defending his f7 square. Clearly knight to h6 is no good because the knight just gets captured. Bishop takes h6. And then the f7 pawn will fall. So black has to defend the pawn with his queen. He plays queen to f6. White now moved pawn to b5. And here it's again awkward for black. If he captures on b5, white will recapture with the bishop and then push his pawn onto a6, and the knight at c6 is looking a little rocky. So black didn't capture the pawn at b5. Instead he moved his knight from c6 to e5. White now played knight takes e5. D pawn took on e5. White pawn captures on a6. Black captures b7, takes a6. And now came a curious maneuver by white. I wonder if you could discover it. Turn off your tapes and decide your next move. White played queen to a4 check, which at first sight just loses time because black plays bishop to d7. Now the queen went back to d1. Black played knight e7, clearly trying to develop, and white finally recaptured his pawn. Queen takes d3. And here we can see the point of his queen a4 check, because what black wants to do is to castle on the king's side. But he would then lose his bishop at d7, which white has lured by his queen a4 move. Meanwhile, the pawn at a6 is under fire, so black chose to retreat here, bishop from d7 to c8, and white played knight to a3. Now we'll leave the game at this point with the comment that white seems to have the better position for several reasons. There's a weak a6 pawn. The white knight can go to c2 and then maybe into b4, threatening a6 again, or it could go to e3 and then come round to d5. The white bishop at c1 could either have a very good diagonal at a3 or it could move to e3. Meanwhile, the black knight at e7 doesn't have great scope if it goes to c6 because it can't get to b4 or d4. So a better position for white here. Now I'd like you to return to diagram 1, switch off the tape to get the position ready. Now from diagram 1, the main move for black is to play knight from g8 to f6. And here white does not need to defend the pawn. He's able to actually castle, which he does. Castles kingside. And first we look at what happens if black captures the second pawn. and plays knight takes e4. White then plays rook e1, and black goes pawn to d5, defending his knight and hitting the bishop at d5. So, how would you now play as white in this position? It doesn't, at first sight, look very promising. White has a very powerful counterblow here. Bishop takes d5, and black plays queen takes d5. Now if you didn't see this sacrifice, switch off the tape again and try and discover what white had in mind. White's second move of the combination is even more spectacular. He plays his knight from b1 to c3. And this is a sort of optical illusion type of move. Apparently black can capture the knight, but if we look more carefully, the pawn at d4 is pinned, and black would lose his queen if he takes the knight. He can't even capture the knight with his knight at e4, because that knight is also pinned. The consequences of this is that white will recover his piece because he's attacking the black queen, and he's putting more pressure on the knight at e4. So black now has to accept that he's no longer a piece up, he's only a pawn up. He has to give his piece back. The question for black now is where to move his queen. He can go backwards, or sideways to h5, or sideways to a5, and there are also various other queen moves. But we'll just concentrate on the three main ones: queen h5, queen d8, and queen a5. First we'll look at the queen moving across to h5, queen to h5. White plays knight takes e4. And what do you think white is threatening in this position? White's threatening to mate in two by knight to f6 double check, king d8, and then rook e8 mate. And for good measure, the knight, when it gets to f6, also attacks the black queen at h5. So black must block this central file, and he plays bishop to e6. White now plays bishop to g5. What was the point of that move? Well, if white didn't play it, black would be able to castle on the queen's side, get quite a good position, especially as it guards his pawn at d4. So bishop to g5. There are also some tactical tricks in the position. Should black carelessly play pawn to f6 here, white can sacrifice his bishop by bishop takes f6, and after pawn takes bishop, knight takes f6 check will fork the black king and queen. And also if black plays pawn to h6, then the white bishop could move into f6 with impunity. Pawn takes bishop again being met by knight takes f6 and the fork on the king and the queen. So black has to tread carefully after bishop g5. He doesn't move either of his pawns. He plays his bishop to e7, getting ready to castle on the other side. White plays bishop takes e7, black knight takes e7. And now white can go into a favourable endgame. He plays knight takes d4, discovering a threat at the queen at h5. Black queen takes d1. White rook from a1 takes on d1. Black castles queenside. And what would be your next move for white? Turn off the tape and decide. White plays knight from e4 to g5. And we can see now that if black moves his bishop, he'll lose his knight at e7. probability. And if he doesn't move the bishop, white will capture a few times on e6, ending up a pawn ahead. And in the end game, black has no compensation for this lost pawn. Right, I'd like you to return now to the position of diagram 3. Turn off your tape to do so. Still looking at the black queen move, queen to h5, knight takes e4, bishop e6, bishop g5. We'll now look at a game between Kamenetsky and Estrin. Now normally you see Estrin on the white side of this variation. In fact, he wrote a really tremendous book, which I recommend you to get. I think you can still get it from Batsford, called The Two Knights' Defence. And much of Keene and Levy's analysis was derived, I believe, from this book. Their book was Opening Repertoire for the Attacking Player. So Kamenetsky versus Estrin. Black moved his bishop here to b4, threatening the white rook at e1. Kamenetsky now sacrificed a pawn. He could have just kept equality by capturing at d4, but he sacrificed a pawn by pawn to c3. Black pawn takes c3, and white b2 takes c3. Black bishop to a5, white queen to c2, black castled, and white went queen from c2 to b2, threatening the pawn at b7. In this position, white was supposed to have a compensation for the pawn, which will be probably a matter for analysis or for experiment. Besides his better development, white might even be able to surround the black queen by moves like h4, followed by knight g3 and pawn to h5 and pawn to h6, combining that with a kingside attack. So an interesting position has arisen. Whether white has compensation for the pawn, as I say, we'll have to find out by games played in the variation. Now return again to diagram 3. Now we'll look at the next retreat for black, which is black queen from d5 to d8. This retreat doesn't look very exciting because it undevelops the black queen, but it was played in the game Ragozin against Botvinnik, ex-world champion Botvinnik, in 1930. Now the advantage for black is the queen is not subjected to such harassment on d8, and also the d4 pawn is still guarded. That's why white doesn't play knight takes e4 here. He plays rook takes e4 check, which, besides checking, also attacks the d4 pawn again. Now, in a game I played recently against Terry Chapman, black didn't know the main line here, which is to play bishop e7. Instead he played bishop e6, which is slightly worse. How would you continue for white in this position? White plays knight takes d4, recovering his pawn. Black played knight takes d4, and white played rook takes d4, threatening the queen at d8. Now black is in some difficulties here. If he moves his bishop to d6, white can put pressure on it with bishop f4 or knight e4. On the other hand, if he moves his queen to f6, white knight to b5 is dangerous. And if he plays queen e7, then his bishop at f8 is locked in. So instead he played his queen from d8 to c8. White played bishop to g5, threatening rook d8 check, and black here defended with pawn to f6. Right, how would you now play as white? Turn off your tapes and decide. White's next move is a very powerful sacrifice. Bishop takes f6. G takes f6. White queen to h5 check. Black played bishop to f7. In fact, after queen h5 check, as I remember, black actually resigned, much to my surprise. I know he's in a bad position, but it was surely premature. So let's consider that he had played bishop f7. How would you continue the attack for white? It's not quite as clear-cut as it may seem, so turn off your tapes and have a good think to work out the variations. Well, the obvious move is rook e1 check, though also rook e4 check is well worth considering. So rook e1 check, black bishop to e7. Now if you try queen c5, which was my first thought, black can defend with bishop to e6. Also possible is white queen from h5 goes back to e2. And this was the reason that my opponent resigned. He thought he was just losing a pawn for nothing. But in this position, black could castle. And if white plays queen takes bishop, black would play rook e8, and white would therefore be in some trouble, having been skewered. However, after queen e2, black castles, white can actually still win a pawn. As long as he doesn't capture the bishop immediately at e7, he'd have to first play queen g4 check, and after the swappage of queens, he can then capture with his rook on e7. So this move, queen back to e2, is, I think, a winning move, so well done if you discovered that. Now I'd like you to return to the position of diagram 4. This is after black plays bishop f7. And we'll look again at rook e1 check, bishop to e7. White has an even more powerful move than queen e2. He can play rook takes on e7 check. Black king takes at e7. Now if you didn't discover this move, turn off the tape and decide how you continue the attack. White's next move has to be precise. Queen c5 check to keep the black king in the middle. Black goes king to e8, and now rook e4 check, black bishop to e6. So what's white's next move? Turn off your tapes again and decide. The winning move for white is now knight d5, which threatens to checkmate at e7. And the point is that if black plays queen d7 to stop the checkmate, then white knight takes on f6 check, forks the king and queen. Right, so after that digression, I think we'll return again to the position of diagram 3. Turn off your tapes to do so. So from diagram 3, black retreats queen d8. White plays rook takes e4 check, and in Ragozin against Botvinnik, black played bishop e7 here. Ragozin now played knight takes d4, and instead of automatically capturing, black actually played pawn to f5 here. A very sharp move. Now in Estrin's book there's an amazing move for white suggested here, bishop to h6, on the grounds that if black takes the rook, white will capture on g7, and if he takes the bishop, white can go queen h5 check. So because f5, the move f5 does weaken that very delicate diagonal from e8 to h5. But we won't look at that move. Bishop h6 will continue down the main line of the Ragozin-Botvinnik game. White played actually rook from e4 to f4. Black now castled, and white played knight takes c6. Black queen takes d1 check. White knight takes d1. Black b7 takes on c6. And white now moved rook from f4 to c4. Here, instead of defending his pawn at c6, black played his bishop from e7 to d6. Now what do you think would happen if white captured by rook takes c6 here? Turn off and consider this question. But if white plays rook takes c6, black gets a strong counter-attack with rook e8, threatening checkmate on the back row. If white tries king f1, then black can go bishop to d7, followed by bishop b5 check, and once again white's in trouble. On the other hand, if instead of king f1, white tries to block the e-file with bishop e3, then pawn to f4 puts white into difficulties. So, all in all, it's a little dangerous for white to capture the pawn at c6. In the actual game, I believe Ragozin played bishop e3, which was also possibly not the best. Instead, it suggested that white should play knight from d1 to c3, not capture at c6, just play his knight to c3, and if possible follow up with bishop f4, and if all goes well, white does have an advantage due to the weakened pawns, black pawns on the queen side. Right, so that deals with the Ragozin-Botvinnik game. Return now to diagram 3. Turn off your tapes to do so. We now look at the main variation, and this is where the black queen goes over to a5. White plays knight takes e4, threatening the discovered check. Black goes bishop e6. Now, what would you play for white here? Well, I think you should not capture the pawn at d4. If you play knight takes d4, black captures knight takes d4, you continue queen takes d4, and then black will checkmate you, queen takes e1. Therefore, a better move is suggested, and this is for white to go bishop to d2, attacking the black queen. Of course, the black queen could now move, but first we'll look at a obvious developing move for black, bishop from f8 to b4. So, what's your choice here? Turn off your tape and choose a move. White has a very neat sacrifice here, which probably leads to his advantage. He plays knight takes d4. Now, you should be aware that if black now captures bishop takes d2, white does not simply recapture the bishop. He first inserts the move knight takes c6, which, as you'll see, is threatening the black queen at a5, and then he recaptures the bishop at d2, leaving himself with the better pawn structure for the endgame. So, back to that position, and this would have been diagram number 6, inserting the moves black bishop to b4, and white knight takes on d4. So black does not play bishop takes d2, instead he plays knight takes d4. Now we get the point of white's play, which is pawn to c3, forking the two pieces. Which one of these pieces should black defend? Well, it's better for black if he retains his dark squared bishop. As we'll see in future examples, that bishop is vital for defending the black squares. First we'll see why. So I want to look at the position where black allows his bishop at b4 to be captured. In this game, black played his knight from d4 to c6. White then took the bishop. Pawn takes on b4. Well, you don't need me to explain why black should not capture with the knight here. Of course, white would play pawn a3 and win it through a pin. So instead, black has to move his queen. He plays his queen from a5 to f5. White plays rook from a1 to c1. And now black castled on the king's side. It might be attractive to castle on the queen's side, but looking at those open files, particularly the open c file, we can understand why black did not do so. Okay, now decide your next move for white. Turn off and have a think. The best move is for white to use his rook on the open c file and particularly on the dark squares. He plays rook c5, attacking the black queen. Black queen goes to g4. Now, you normally would not expect white to exchange the queens, but his position is so powerful he can afford to do so and still have a winning attack. White plays queen takes g4, bishop takes g4, white rook from c5 to g5. The bishop moves from g4 to e6, and now white puts pressure on g7 again. He plays bishop from d2 to c3. To block the attack, black plays pawn to f6. What would you now play for white? Well, the pawn at f6 is only apparently defended. This is another optical illusion due to the effect of the pin. White can play knight takes f6 check. There's no use black playing pawn takes f6, it's illegal. So he plays king to f7. And again, what would you choose for white? Turn off your tapes, decide your next move. Well, possibly you chose knight takes h7, which is a good move, but in this game white centralized the knight, which is also very powerful. Knight to d5. And here black's position is completely hopeless. Not only is he threatened with rook takes g7 check, he's also threatened with knight takes c7, and if he tries something like bishop takes d5, then rook takes g7 is even checkmate. So that's a pretty disastrous and drastic finish. What we learned from this game is the power upon the black squares that white is exercising. His bishop at c3 has a marvelous line leading down to g7, and his rook at g5 also helps in the attack on that point. I'll return, please, to diagram number 6. Now, after bishop d2, black bishop to b4, white knight takes on d4, black knight takes on d4, white pawn to c3. In this example, black tries to retain his dark squared bishop, so he plays bishop from b4 to e7. White captures c takes d4, and black goes queen from a5 to d5. Now came rook to c1, and here black played pawn to c6. Okay, how would you continue for white in this position? Turn off your tapes and think carefully about this next move. White's next move brilliantly destroyed black's setup. He played bishop from d2 to g5. Now apparently this loses a piece. But after black plays bishop takes g5, white can now recover the piece with rook to c5, putting a skewer on the black queen. Black plays queen back to d7, and white plays rook from c5 takes on g5. And once again, black is in difficulty on the dark squares again. What would happen, say, if he castled kingside? Well, then white would win his queen with knight f6 check, forking king and queen. And the same goes if black tried to defend his g7 pawn with pawn to g6. Added to this fact that white is also threatening moves like knight c5, black therefore decided to bail out into an endgame by exchanging his g7 pawn for white's d pawn. This was not a particularly good deal for him, because the white d pawn is weak, and when black loses his g7 pawn, his kingside pawns are then split. But after all, it is the best that black can do in the situation. So black castled queenside. White played rook takes g7, and black played queen takes d4. And we see in this variation that white is quite prepared to go into an endgame if he gets an advantage, as he does here. He doesn't have to win every game brilliantly in the attack. So white plays queen takes d4, black rook takes d4, and turn off your tape and decide what you would play for white here. Now we're not thinking about mating attacks now. It's pawn advantages and pawn structure, piece placing. Those are the factors which are important here. And the a2 pawn happens to be under attack, so white moves it from a2 to a3. Black then switched his rook from h8 over to d8. Okay, now there's a pawn you can capture at h7. Would you make this capture, or would you do something else? Well, if you played rook takes h7, I seriously suggest that you buy some books on tactics and do a lot of tactical puzzles, because rook takes h7 falls into a transparent trap. Rook takes h7 could be met by rook takes e4, and then if white captures rook takes e4, rook d1, it's going to be a back row mate. After rook takes h7, black could also play rook d1, which is also winning, because if white goes king f1, bishop to c4 check wins. So the pawn at h7 is definitely covered with large quantities of poison. Therefore, let's put the white rook back on g7 and the black pawn back on h7. Seeing as he's threatened with this back row mate combination, white played his pawn up to f3. You might have expected him to play pawn to h3, but we are in an ending, and therefore the idea is to bring the king closer to the endgame. That's why white king may come up to f2, because you have to centralize your king in the endgame. Equally, if white had moved pawn to g3, this is not the best idea because it weakens the white squares. Black could possibly move his bishop into h3 and already be threatening rook takes e4 followed by rook d1 and another type of back row mate coming up. So pawn f3 is the best of the three pawn moves. Black now plays his pawn from h7 to h5. White fixed it by playing pawn from h2 to h4. And this is where we leave the position with an advantage to white due to the weak black kingside pawn at h5 and the possibility of white gaining a passed pawn on the king's side. And also the white pieces are well placed. Knight at e4 is well placed, and the rook at g7 is very actively placed. So advantage to white in the endgame. Now back again to diagram 6. Turn off your tapes to do so. After white bishop to d2, black does not have to go bishop b4. He can simply move his queen from a5 back to d5. So, what would you do if your opponent played this move? Turn off and decide. Now remember that black is trying to castle on the queen's side to complete development and hold on to his pawn at d4. Therefore white's next move suggests itself, bishop to g5, stopping the castling queen's side and also preparing to sacrifice the bishop if black plays pawn to f6, because as we know, after bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6. Knight takes f6 check will fork king and queen. Therefore, black doesn't dare touch their left pawn. Instead, he moves bishop from f8 to e7. White goes bishop takes on e7. And in the game between Radulov and Shayanovsky, played in the Ukraine, black did not capture with the knight, because he didn't want to lose his pawn back at d4. Instead, he played the dramatic king takes e7, preparing maybe to swing his rook from h8 to d8 and then slip his king back to f8 into safety, if he gets the time. And he doesn't get the time, as we shall see from the outcome of this game. So, playing white in this position, what would be your move? Turn off the tape and think about it. So time and opening of lines is vitally important here, and therefore Radulov's move was pawn to c4. Now if black captures en passant, what would you then do for white? Turn off your tape, and when you've decided, turn your tape over to side 2 in order to find the answer to that question. Central attack, side 2. Now after black plays pawn takes on c3 en passant, and that's from diagram number 7, the obvious move is for white to play queen takes d5. If black recaptures with the bishop, white can make a discovered attack with the knight, discovered check with the knight. But things are not so simple. There's no really decent discovered check by the knight. If he plays knight takes c3 check, black will retreat the bishop to e6. So instead of swapping the queens, Radulov had intended to play queen to c2, which puts black into tremendous difficulties, because white is threatening to play rook to d1, and the files are getting opened against the black king. This position would be very hard for black to defend, and therefore Shayanovsky declined to take the pawn in this way. So returning to diagram 9 again, and we put the black pawn back on d4, and the white pawn back onto c4. Black did not capture en passant. He played queen takes on c4. White continued rook c1. And now it's too dangerous for black to capture on a2, because white would take at d4 with his knight, and once again the black king would get into serious difficulties. So black brought his queen back to d5. He is after all 2 pawns ahead at the moment. White continued rook c5, this square again being used very effectively by white, the c5 square. Black played queen d7. And now, turn off your tapes and try and find out white's next brilliant move. White's next move was the deadly but effective queen c1. Once again, the dark squares are the key to the understanding of this position, and by shifting the white queen to the side 1 square, the queen then gets access to all the squares on the dark diagonals, the ones leading from c1 up to h6, and in some cases the diagonal leading out to a3. So queen c1 was the move played, and besides using the diagonals, white also puts pressure down the open c file. He's immediately threatening knight e5, and if black captures, knight takes e5, rook takes c7, will win the black queen. This explains black's next move, rook a8 to c8. So it's your turn again. What would you play for white? Turn off and decide your next move. Well, possibly you chose queen g5 check, but then the black king would slip back to f8. Radloff played a much more stylish move. He played his pawn from b2 to b4. Now apparently black can capture this pawn, but if he does so, if he plays knight takes b4, the white queen would then go from c1 to a3, lining herself up against the black king at e7. And of course, if the black knight now moves away to c6, then rook takes c6. Discovered check finishes the game. So, return the queen to c1, the black knight to c6, and the white pawn should be on b4 now. Seeing as he could not take the pawn, black decided to retreat his king to f8, which also gives his knight a flight square. He played king to f8, white went pawn to b5, and the black knight went back to e7. White came in again, knight to e5. The black queen retreated to d8, and white played knight e4 to g5. Now stop the tape for a second or longer and admire the white position. You can see that all the white pieces are now placed on black squares. He has a row of 3 on the 5th row, and his queen, rook and king are on the 1st row. I don't think this is entirely an accident. Black, on the other hand, has just got a huddled lot of pieces on his back row. His king is not castled, his rooks are not connected. He has his 2 extra pawns, but that's all he has to be proud of. Black played here pawn from h7 to h6. So, how would you continue for white here? Turn off your tapes and decide. Well, maybe you decided to go straight into the attack by knight takes e6 check. This did not happen. Let's see why. If knight takes e6 check, black plays pawn takes e6. Then possibly queen f4 check, king g8, queen f7 check, king h7, and now queen takes e6. It all looks very powerful, but what we've done is to reorganize the black position, and it's helped black really, because now his rooks can connect. He can play probably queen to d6, beat off the white attack, maybe return one of the pawns, which he's already done, and possibly live to tell the tale. So that would explain why, from the position of diagram 8, Radulov, who was a very strong grandmaster, did not immediately cash in his chips with knight takes e6 check. Instead, he retreated his knight from g5 to f3, biding his time, because basically black has a very difficult task trying to make sense of his position. So after the knight went back to f3, black immediately replied with a mistake. Possibly he felt the pressure had been relieved, but he played the fatal move pawn to h5, and this allowed the white knight to come back in, knight to g5, and this time the knight came for good. Black played rook to h6, and white moved queen to f4, and now black realized that rook f6 is useless because of knight h7 check, forking the king and rook. Meanwhile, as he's threatened by a checkmate followed by knight takes e6 check, followed by queen takes f7 mate, f7's got to be defended, so black played queen to e8. So your Radulov again. What move do you choose here for white? Now white struck with knight e5 takes on f7. Black played bishop takes f7. And what's the follow-up for white? White's next move is rook from c5 to e5. Black is now totally tied up. He still can't play rook f6 because of knight h7 check. White's going to capture on e7, and then f7 will fall as well. There is absolutely no defense for black. Black played king to g8. White rook takes e7. Black queen f8. White rook takes f7. Black queen to d6. And after white queen to f5, black resigned, thus ending a tremendous display of attacking skill by Radulov. Now we should return again to diagram 1. Turn off your tapes to reach this position. From diagram 1, we'll play the move black knight to f6, white castles on the king side, and now instead of knight takes e4, which leads into variations of the two knights defense, we look at the other main move, which is bishop f8 to c5. And here we're going to be able to play our Max Langer variation. White continues pawn to e5, attacking the knight at f6. Now, besides the main move, which is pawn to d5 here, black can also move his knight to various squares. Some of these squares are completely hopeless. Knight to h5 loses the knight after pawn to g4. A knight to g8 simply puts black further behind in development. But there are moves knight e4 and knight g4 to look at. First we'll look at black knight to e4. Now turn off your tapes here and decide how you would take advantage of this move. There are several ideas here, for example queen e2 or rook e1, but the clearest one suggested by Keene and Levy is white going bishop to d5. The advantage of playing bishop to d5 is that black hasn't got the move pawn to d5 to defend his knight. So bishop d5, black now has to defend with pawn to f5. White captures e takes f6 en passant. Black plays knight takes f6. And now white does not check. He plays bishop to g5. Black himself is unable to castle because of the white bishop at d5. He plays bishop from c5 to e7, and white plays bishop takes on f6. Now supposing black played pawn takes f6 here, how would you continue for white? Turn off your tapes and think about this. Pawn to f6 is a terrible move because white then plays knight to g5. And if the knight's taken, queen comes to h5 and then f7 mate. If the knight isn't taken, it's going to come into f7, forking the black queen and rook. So really black cannot take with the pawn, so we'll have those pieces back. The white knight at f3, and the white bishop should be on f6, and the black pawn should be on g7. So black plays bishop takes f6. White now plays rook e1 check, black knight e7, white knight to e5. Black bishop takes on e5. White queen to h5 check. And black's position is quite terrible. No mystery why. It's his king. If he plays knight g6, rook takes e5 check. If he plays pawn to g6, queen takes on e5, threatening the rook at f8, h8. Black plays rook to f8, and now simply knight d2. White just builds up against the black position. He's threatening knight e4 to f6. It'll be almost impossible for black to get his king into safety, and so white can build up along the e file in a way of doubling rooks as well as bringing his knight in. So a bad result for black, this position. Return now to the position of diagram number 9. So from diagram number 9, a better move for black is knight to g4. This threatens the white pawn at e5, and white therefore hasn't got such easy ways to obtain the advantage. The best suggestion is bishop to f4, which itself has a threat. If black just automatically castles here, white would be able to play pawn to h3, drive the black knight back to h6, and then capture on h6 with his bishop, doubling the black pawns and weakening the black king side. That's why black has to react strongly in the center, and he plays pawn to d6, as much to give his knight a retreat square as to undermine the white center. White plays pawn takes on d6, black bishop takes d6, and white rook e1 check, reaching an important crossroads, which I've marked by having a diagram number 10. And in this position, black has got a choice of 3 moves, really. He can play knight e7, bishop e7, or possibly king to f8. Now, let's look first at knight e7. How would you continue for white in this position? Turn off your tape and decide. After knight e7, white plays bishop takes d6, black queen takes d6, and now I hope you don't play knight takes d4. That would show a certain obliviousness, because you would then lose something on h2, your pawn with check. So instead, capture the pawn at d4 with your queen. Rather a subtle move. If black now swaps the queens, he discovers he's unable to castle without losing his knight at e7. On the other hand, if he castles straight away, white will swap the queens and then capture at e7. The upshot of this is that the black king has to stay in the center. His development is severely impaired, and white has a very strong advantage in this position. Now return again to diagram number 10. Turn off your tapes to reach the correct position. So instead of knight e7, black can also play bishop e7. What would you then do for white? Decide this question. Keene and Levy suggest that the simplest thing is for white to just recover his pawn with a slight advantage. They manage this by playing bishop to b5, black castles, bishop takes c6, black pawn takes c6, and then knight takes d4. White has got his pawn back. The black queenside pawns are weak. Finally, return again to diagram 10, and we'll look at probably the most complex of the defenses, and this is for black to play his king to f8. So have you got the position? If necessary, turn off your tape, and don't forget to put the white bishop back on c4 in this variation. This is something I quite often forget to do. Now the king f8 line shouldn't really be good, because obviously black's development is impaired seriously. The rook at h8 is shut out, and the position is an open one with the files being opened. So really black shouldn't be able to hold this position very easily. Nonetheless, all these positions have to be played, and you might find that you haven't got the skill to win this advantageous position. We'll look at the analysis. White bishop takes on d6 check, black queen takes on d6, and now white plays pawn to c3. The plan is that if black captures, pawn takes on c3, white will recapture, knight takes c3. Again, a very open and strong position for white. Instead of capturing at c3, black therefore resorts to tactics. He plays his queen from d6 to c5. And this not only threatens to capture the bishop at c4, but has a hidden threat. That is to play pawn takes c3, and then swoop in with his queen on the f2 square. However, white has a strong counter to this. He plays knight b1 to d2. And black plays pawn takes on c3. So, what was the point of white's play? Why did he play knight to d2? In fact, what does white do now? Turn off your tapes. What would you play? White has a stunning victory here. He plays knight from d2 to e4, attacking the black queen and defending his pawn at f2. Alas, it leaves the bishop on prise at c4. Black queen takes c4. But what did white have in mind after the loss of the piece? If you haven't seen white's next move, then I give you another chance. Turn off your tapes and decide. White's winning move is knight from e4 to d6. Threatens the black queen at c4, threatens rook e8 mate, and if the knight itself is captured, white can play queen takes d6 check with a quick mate. Right, now I'd like you to go back to the position of diagram 10 again. Turn off your tapes. We need again to look at the variation after black king to f8. It's not finished yet. Bishop takes d6 check. Black queen takes d6. White pawn to c3. Black queen to c5. And white goes knight to d2. Knight from b1 to d2. Now instead of playing pawn takes c3 here, black has another idea. He plays his pawn from d4 down to d3, discovering an attack on the f2 square again. Now this position is also worth thinking about. It's quite possible to play rook f1 here, but there's an interesting suggestion in the Keene and Levy book of playing knight d4, sacrificing another pawn. Black goes knight takes d4. White goes pawn takes d4. Black goes queen takes d4. And white plays queen to f3, threatening checkmate at f7. Black's next move is queen to f6. So what would you play here for white? Turn off your tapes, think about it. Well, you're 2 pawns down, and if you play queen takes d3 here, you lose immediately. Black plays queen takes f2 check, king h1, queen takes rook check, rook takes queen, and then the knight comes into f2 check, forking your queen and your king. So that's no good. Now we actually are in the position of diagram 11, so if you've moved the pieces you can reset them. There's a suggestion by Gligorich in this position of playing the white queen from f3 to g3. I'm not quite sure what he has in mind if black simply blocks with queen to d6, just trying to swap off the queens to go into an endgame a pawn ahead. So let's put the white queen back on f3 and the black queen back on d6. There may be a better move here in white playing his queen from f3 to d5. Now it's obvious black can't move his queen to d6 now because of queen takes f7 mate. But what if he plays queen takes f2 check, king h1? Now here he is in trouble because white's threatening rook f1. He's also threatening queen d8 mate. Queen of course can't take the knight on d2. Black could defend by playing bishop e6 here. And I think white could play queen takes b7, threatening the rook. Black plays rook to e8. And now, very powerful move, rook takes e6. If black captures with the pawn, rook f1 will pin and win the queen. If he captures with the rook, white can go bishop takes e6. Black goes queen takes d2. And white plays bishop takes g4. And white's a piece ahead, plus he has the attack. So, from diagram 11, queen to d5 looks like a promising attacking move. Now return again to diagram 9, turn off your tapes to get the position ready. We'll look now at the main variation where black plays pawn from d7 to d5. White plays pawn takes on f6, and black goes pawn takes c4. Now the regular move here is for white to go rook e1 check. In some ways I find this unsatisfactory because it only helps black to develop his bishop. He can move his bishop to e6, and then white has to move a piece twice to keep the attack going. He has to play knight g5. So I'm wondering if the move pawn takes g7 here might not be better. Let's have a look at that move. Pawn takes g7, black goes rook to g8, and now we play bishop to g5. I tried this in a recent quick play tournament, and my opponent immediately blundered by moving his queen from d8 to d6. So how would you carry on for white here? What would be your move? White played knight to d2, threatening to, of course, come in on e4, and then to come into f6. And to stop the arrival of the knight on e4, black played bishop to f5. But now the check rook e1 was even more effective, because the black king has to move. Black played king to d7, white played knight takes c4. And in this position, my opponent was so disorientated by the turn the game had taken, instead of going down 20 moves of the Max Langer main variation, he'd somehow been sidetracked, and here he blundered by moving his queen from d6 to g6. And no prizes for guessing white's next move. Knight comes into e5, forking the king and the queen. However, supposing black had not blundered in this way, supposing instead of moving his queen from d6 to g6, supposing he'd moved it up to d5, what would you have played in this position? Turn off your tape and decide your move. Well, during the game, while my opponent was thinking out his next blunder, I was considering that the move knight e3 would be good here, using the optical illusion that that pawn at d4 is pinned. However, after knight e3, black can go queen e4, and though the black position is precarious, he may be able to hang on here. So a better move than knight e3 is the simple knight from c4 to e5 check. If black now captures the knight, he immediately loses a piece after rook takes e5. So he has to go king c8. White plays knight takes c6, and if now black plays pawn takes knight, then rook e5 once again wins a piece. So black has to go queen takes c6, and white plays knight takes d4 here with a very strong position. He's got his pawns back. In fact, I think he's a pawn or so ahead, and the black king is in a complete mess. Right, well, let's now return again to the position of diagram number 12. From the position of diagram 12, black doesn't need to blunder with queen d6. In fact, the recommendation in the Estrin book is bishop e7, after which white plays bishop takes e7. And here, if black captures with the queen, then white can play knight takes d4. If he captures with the knight, then either queen takes d4 or knight takes d4. The book actually suggests he should play king takes e7 after white captures at e7. I find this move a little hard to swallow because the black king is obviously quite exposed, and we also have his problems on the black squares, which we've noted in earlier variations. He hasn't got his black squared bishop anymore. So this position, I think, is worth playing out for white to see if white actually does get an advantage from this position. Clearly black could have some counter chances down the g-file, but weighed against that are his weak dark squares and his, of course, the fact his king will take a little while to get into safety. So return now to diagram 9. Black plays pawn d5, white e takes f6. Black pawn takes c4, and we'll look at the main line, rook e1 check. Now, king f8 leads black into difficulties after bishop g5, and I suggest you look at the game Kazic against Vukovic from 1940 for a spectacular victory by white in this particular variation. King f8 is not really recommended. Main line is for black to play bishop e6. And white plays knight g5. Now it would be very nice for black if he could play queen takes f6 here. In fact, let's play queen takes f6. What's wrong with the move? Turn off your tape and decide the answer to that question. The problem is that queen takes f6 loses a piece after knight takes e6, pawn takes e6, and then queen h5 check, forking the king at e8 and the bishop at c5. Slightly unlucky for black, but that's the way it goes. Now return to the position of diagram number 13. Turn off if you need to. So knight g5 prevents black from playing queen takes f6. Black has to play queen to d5 to stop white from getting this forking check with his queen. At this point, I'd like you to think carefully. What would you play for white in this position? Now, black's game is looking reasonably promising. He only needs one move to connect the rooks, whereas even though white's castled, his queen side is completely undeveloped, and furthermore the black pawns at c4 and d4 look very imposing. Now white redresses the balance somewhat by his next move, knight c3. Okay, rub your eyes again. Pawn takes knight doesn't work because of queen takes queen. This time it's the bishop at e6 that's pinned. So this gains white a developing tempo, and also the black queen now has to move. It has only one real square, queen to f5. Black now threatens pawn takes knight, so the knight at c3 moves to e4. This is a vital position, a sort of crossroads again. It's diagram 14. And in this position, there are three main moves to be looked at. Two of them are bishop retreats. One is bishop f8, an odd-looking retreat suggested by Rubinstein. Another, the more natural-looking bishop b6. Both of these moves are slow. They allow white to get a tremendous attack going very quickly. So probably the safest move is for black to castle queenside. We'll look, however, at bishop f8 first to see how actually does white whip up this attack. So black goes bishop f8. Black king is still in the middle. What would you play for white here? White strikes at black's weak spot. He plays knight takes f7. Very elegant move. If black captures with the bishop, knight d6 double check. It's going to win the black queen. So black has to take with the king. And white's next move is knight g5 check. Here there are two main moves for black. He can go to g6, he can go to g8. The moves are discussed in great detail in both books, the Estrin and the Keene and Levy book. I'd like to select a representative variation. So I'd like to look at black going king to g8. And white plays pawn to g4. A question here. If black captures the pawn with check, how does white continue? Well, taking the pawn on g4 is not advisable. White would play queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, and then f7 is checkmate. Now return to diagram 15. After pawn to g4, black has also got the opportunity to take on f6 with his queen. Queen takes f6. This also is not very good. The reason is that when white plays rook takes e6, recovering his piece with tempo, the black queen has to go back to d8. And white can follow up with queen f3, threatening queen f7 mate. Black goes queen to d7. I'd like you to try and find white's next winning move. Have a good think about this. So white played the spectacular rook e7. This is an interference move. If the knight or the bishop take, then white plays queen f7 mate. On the other hand, if black plays queen takes rook, then we get another checkmate. Queen to d5 check, and that's it. Mate next move. Okay, that was a rather spectacular win. Occurred in a simultaneous display and possibly, I think, occurred before that. Let's return again to diagram 15. Turn off your tapes if you need to. Now from diagram 15, black's best defense is not to take either pawn. He should really move his queen back to g6. That keeps his position as active as possible. White plays rook takes e6. and he's threatening now to play pawn to f7 check, and that will win the black queen. So black has to play pawn takes f6. Fortunately for white, his knight at g5 is not really attacked, because the pawn at f6 is pinned, so white can use the time to bring up his reserves. And here comes the first, queen to f3. Comes in with a threat of rook takes f6. Black goes king g7 to guard this pawn, and to get his king off the dangerous white diagonal, which we saw white used so effectively in the last example. So king g7, white now brings in another man, bishop f4. Black went knight d8, driving the rook away and preparing, if he can, to win that knight at g5. The rook obligingly retreated. Rook went to e4, and black now realized he could not take the knight. Well, he could, but if he did, white would play bishop e5 check, and then take on h8, and then take on f8 if black recaptured with the king. So that wasn't quite on yet to play pawn takes knight. Black instead went pawn to h5, trying to get some counterplay against the white king. White moved his rook. He played rook takes on d4. He's at this point trying to come in on d7. Black played pawn takes on g4. Pawn takes on g4. White played rook d7 check. The knight went to f7. So here it wouldn't be right for white to capture on f7. His queen at f3 is under attack. What I believe he played was queen takes b7, though some books say he played queen takes g4. I think he played queen takes b7, and after pawn takes knight, bishop e5 check. There were too many black pieces on prise, really. His rook at a8, and then his rook at h8 is also under attack. So this led to white's advantage in a game between Estrin and Webnitsky. Now, please reset your pieces in the position of diagram 14. Turn off your tape if you need to. As I said before, this is a crucial crossroads in the position, and one of the moves we looked at was bishop to f8. The variations arising from these three variations, that is bishop f8, bishop b6, and castle's queenside, are extremely complicated, but they're well worth learning, and it's well worth your time spent studying the variations, and also getting a friend of yours, say, to test you on the variations. But when this friend tests you, don't cheat by sort of trying to get hints off the person. Try as much as possible to learn the variations yourself. Your friend is only testing you, not helping you. And let's face it, when you play a game of chess, you don't have many people helping you on the actual board. Usually they're standing around laughing at you playing. So you really have to learn this sort of independence, and as I said, put some time into learning these very complicated variations. They are very interesting, and you'll find it's well worthwhile. Now we look at the second variation, which is black going his bishop from c5 back to b6. This is not by any means as disastrous as the Rubinstein idea, but nonetheless white gets a strong attack here. The thing to remember about the Rubinstein variation is that white sacrifices at f7, whereas this variation, bishop b6, white does not sacrifice, not at first anyway. What he does is to try and prevent black from castling queenside, and he does that by getting his bishop to g5. So that idea may help you to remember some of the moves. White starts off by playing pawn takes on g7. The black rook goes to g8. And now a very common move in this variation of the Max Langer, White plays pawn to g4. He's got to play it at this point. If he captures at e6 and then plays pawn to g4, he will be met by black playing rook takes g7, and his pawn itself will be pinned. His pawn at g4 will be pinned, and the variation will be ruined. So you've got to make sure you get these moves in the right order. After pawn to g4, black's queen is very short of squares. Going back to d5 leads to immediate disaster. White knight goes to f6 checks. So where does the black queen go after pawn to g4? It's got to move to g6, really. E5 would be no good, really, after queen f3, I think. So black queen goes to g6. White now goes knight takes e6. Black mustn't take back with the queen. He has to take back with the pawn. And remembering our plan, which was to stop black castling, we've played bishop to g5, with the added threat of playing knight f6 check, forking king and rook. To defend against that, black plays rook takes g7, and now it's not recommended to check at f6 straight away. Instead, queen comes to f3, which is one of the advantages you'll find of making this pawn move, pawn to g4, earlier. It's true that pawn to g4 weakens the white king side, but by driving the queen back to g6, you enable your queen to come to an active square. And now if black plays something like knight e5, white would plonk his knight in on f6 check and then capture the knight at e5 with his rook. Now black's got various moves after white plays queen f3. We'll select one of them, which is king to d7. White continues knight f6 check. The king goes to c8, and now white plays rook takes e6. Black plays queen takes g5. And now you may be wondering what on earth is going on. Well, what on earth is going on is that white plays pawn to h4. First question, what happens if black plays queen takes h4 here? Well, the point of white's pawn to h4 was to drive the queen away from the defense of the f5 square. And white could then finish off the game by rook d8 check, black knight to d8, and queen f5 check with a quick mate. Now remember this idea because it turns up quite a lot in the subsequent variations. Now let's put the black queen back on g5 and the white pawn back on h4. This is in fact diagram 16, with white having just played pawn to h4. This position has been analysed very extensively. There are also moves like queen to g6 that black can play. I'm going to look at queen to a5 here. Still guards the f5 square. And now, how would you continue white's attack? Turn off the tape and decide your next move. What white plays is rook e8 check, knight to d8, and now knight to d5. Plan is to get the queen to f5 check. Supposing here black played rook to d7, what would you do for white? Turn off the tape and decide your answer. Well, after rook d7, white goes queen f5. Black queen takes d5. White rook takes d8 check. Black king takes d8. And white queen f8 checkmate. Very pleasing variation. And as we're coming to the end of the tape, this may be a good time to end the talk. You'll find the continuation, the final moves of the analysis of the bishop b6 variation in the booklet, and also a good analysis of the castle's queenside variation. And all it remains to me to do is to wish you luck in learning this opening and wish you success in playing it. Thank you and goodbye.